My co-reader might have, but I never once awarded a summa. And I read some pretty good theses, too. Master's in Philosophy and Economics in 1990, and then was back to Cambridge to Harvard's sister institution, MIT, where she earned her PhD in economics in very short order. She completed a round trip to Harvard in '94, signing on as Assistant Professor of Economics, and at present she is the Morris Kahn Associate Professor of Economics at Harvard. In the 14 years since her BA, she's won no less than, yes, 14 major fellowships and grants. I don't know which of these caused her the greatest satisfaction, but for my money, her 1988, 1990 Rhodes Scholarship and the Hoops Prize she won for her Summa thesis at Harvard would be among the most significant. To match her 14 awards in 14 years, she has, yes, 14 published papers, as well as a book on the way. Her most recent articles cover important and very timely topics ranging from school finance equalization to effects of class size on student achievement. You may hear some surprises for some of you about that. To school productivity, effects of school choice, interrelationships between schooling and family income, tax incentives for higher education, effects of private school vouchers, and returns from attending selective colleges. As you may know, I'm not one of those economists who puts much stock in predictions, particularly predictions about the future, but I do feel quite safe in making a prediction tonight. Professor Hoxby will be a central figure in her field for many more decades to come. Professor Hoxby.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, President Gillis, and thank you all for coming here. I'm delighted to find that Harvard has an independent school district because I hope they'll let me do research in their classrooms. So tonight what I'm going to be talking about is options for education reform. And let me just start out by trying to say why I think we need education reform in the United States. Before you start reforming a system, you ought to have a sense of what the problem is, a sort of diagnosis of the problem. So we're going to start with the diagnosis of the problem, and then I'm going to tell you just a little bit about some of the medicines we've already used, and then I'm going to tell you about where we might go from here and what education reforms are in play right now. So this is the basic problem. Can I get color, or is that not going to happen? Is there some color up there? Okay.
It is in color. I'll have it.
Okay. All right, so this is the basic problem. In the United States, we have what I would call a productivity crisis in K through 12 education. Many people talk about achievement having fallen in the United States. In fact, that's not quite right. Here, what I'm showing you is math scores on the National Assessment of Educational Progress and reading scores on the National Assessment of Educational Progress, and they're both for 17-year-olds, so you want to think about people who are leaving high school approximately. And you can see that they're quite flat over time. And this figure is actually designed so that if students were to move one standard deviation on one of these two tests, the National Assessment of Educational Progress, they would go all the way from the bottom of this chart to the top of the chart. So clearly we haven't made very much progress because we're doing pretty much flat in math and reading for 17-year-olds. Per pupil spending is the line that's going up right throughout the chart, and that is inflation adjusted in the United States. It's adjusted by the Consumer Price Index. So if you look at per pupil spending going up and achievement staying flat, what's going to happen to productivity? Well, productivity is falling very sharply in the United States. And this is what productivity looks like. National Assessment of Educational Progress points per $1,000 of per pupil spending. So we have what I would describe as a productivity crisis, very flat achievement, rising spending over time, and really two problems come out of this productivity crisis. One is that we're not spending more money for no reason at all. We're spending more money because we want achievement to improve in the United States. And we believe that we are in an economy and in a world where knowledge is important, and we'd like our students to be scoring higher. The other problem with having such low productivity, and productivity that's falling so rapidly in the United States, is that we have an economy that is increasingly based on knowledge or skills. And you cannot support an economy that is increasingly based on knowledge and skills when you have a sector that feeds directly into that part of the economy that has plunging productivity. So I think we have a serious problem in the future if we're not able to raise the productivity of the K through 12 education sector in the United States. Another way to look at this productivity problem is to look at us versus our competitors, other countries around the world. I'm not sure how well this is going to show up without the, well, it's showing up a bit in color. We are the pink bar at the top. This is per pupil spending in 1995-96. And these other countries are the other, basically European countries, other first world countries that are competing with us for really first world skill-based type of economies. You can see that we're spending more than $1,000 more than our next nearest rival in terms of per pupil spending on public education. So we're certainly willing to invest a lot in education in the United States. Unfortunately, our performance relative to that same group of countries is pretty mediocre. We're not the lowest country in terms of math scores. These are 8th graders, and this is the TIMSS, or the third international math and science study. But you can see that we are down around the middle of the group in math, despite the fact that we're spending the most. So we have the lowest productivity of any country in the group because we're spending so much. Reading scores look quite similar. You can see that we're not doing terribly, but we're in the middle of the pack. Well, this productivity problem is going to be a problem for the future of the United States, both, I think, just in terms of the type of culture and the type of society we have if we don't succeed in raising achievement, and also in our basically supporting our economy, supporting an increasingly knowledge-based economy. So it's not correct to say that people haven't been worried about K through 12 education in the United States over time. People have been very worried about it basically throughout the 20th century. There's been a lot of discussion about what we can do, certainly for the past 30 years. So what are some of the things that people have tried to do to raise student achievement over the past 30 years? Well, one of them is a big reduction in class size. So this is a graph showing you what has happened to class size and the pupil-teacher ratio in U.S. public schools from 1970 to the present over the same time period. And you can see that class size has fallen quite dramatically over this period of time from around 25 students per class to just about 20 students per class, which is a sizable reduction. So it does not look like reducing class size has performed miracles for us in terms of raising achievement. The other big change that has happened over the past 30 years is that we have directed an increasing share of K through 12 spending to disadvantaged students, and I define disadvantaged here as either those needing remedial attention or students who are from poor families. Now, I think in 1970, the hypothesis was that one of the reasons American achievement was as low as it was that we were not directing nearly enough spending to the students who needed it the most. We were not directing enough education spending to them. Well, it may still be that disadvantaged students in the United States do not get enough educational resources, but there have been big increases in the share of total resources being directed to them, and we have not seen much improvement in achievement over this period of time. Now, if I've sort of told you a gloom and doom story about productivity in American schools, and I do think it's a very big problem. There's another way of looking at this problem, however, and that is that if we were to return to 1970 productivity levels in American schools today, we are spending so much money on our public schools compared to other countries and compared to ourselves in the past that we would have much, much higher achievement levels, and in fact achievement levels that would make us very happy. We would have achievement levels such that about 75% of students in the United States would be scoring in the advanced category on the National Assessment of Educational Progress, where only about 7 or 8% of students are scoring now. So we would really be raising the entire population scores on achievement tests. So I think we have a big area in which we can move if we are able to pass the right reforms. So far, we haven't found those. Now, there are two types of education reform that are really in play today, and they are standards-based accountability, which I think I don't need to tell anyone in Texas about, and school choice. So I'm going to talk about both of those things, but let me start by saying that standards-based accountability and school choice are two policies that are not mutually exclusive. You don't have to choose one or the other. In fact, many people feel that they're somewhat complementary to one another. And the reason that I think that they're complementary is that one of the first things that standards do is they increase the amount of information that parents and school reformers and school administrators have available to them. Now, not all of this information is perfect information, but it is information about what's happening in the schools. So it would enable a parent who wanted to make choices between schools to make wiser choices, so to make choices that were more likely to be affected by differences in achievement and less likely to be a function of pretty superficial things about a school like, oh, you know, how well the team played or something like that. Maybe I shouldn't say that superficial, but it's one thing that we wouldn't like parents to only think about. So I think that they are complementary policies, and that's how I think we want to think about them together. But I'm going to talk about them one at a time. So let me first talk a little bit about standards-based accountability. Well, most standards in the United States are based on standardized tests, not unlike the TOS that you have here in Texas. And they tend to be rather low-stakes accountability systems compared to international systems. So in no state in the United States, even in places where we talk about high-stakes accountability, do we have the sort of accountability that a system like the French would have, where they have a top-down system, and in order for your child to progress to the next level, he or she must do very well on, say, the 6th grade test in order to be fed into the right sort of middle school, and after that he has to do very well on the 8th grade test in order to get into the right sort of school that serves 9th through 10th graders, and this continues throughout the system. These are high-stakes systems in the sense that you can never retake a test. Once you fall off the wagon and get directed into a lower sort of track, you never get to go back. And the students who experience the higher tracks have much, much more spent on them than the students who experience the lower track. So it's a really high-stakes accountability system. We don't have that in any state in the United States. Instead, we tend to have rather low-stakes accountability systems. I'll find something for it. Now this slide shows you support for standards in the United States. American parents and legislators tend to be very supportive of this standards movement. You can see that these 3 bars here show you how many people support academic standards for students, and the 2 bars on the right show you how many people support standards for teachers. Now I know these aren't showing up quite as clearly as I would like, but the bars that are in the pinkish red colors are showing you the people in favor, and the blue are showing you the people who either oppose or strongly oppose standards. So you can see that in terms of academic standards for students, almost everyone supports them. Employers are extremely in favor of academic standards for students, and even parents, who presumably have to bear the brunt of some of the complaints about academic standards, are highly in favor of standards for students. If you ask about standards for teachers, there's a little bit less favoring of them. So if you ask people, should pay depend on student achievement, teacher pay depend on student achievement, the majority favor that sort of a system, but less strongly. And if you ask people whether they're in favor of teacher testing, the majority favor that and quite strongly favor that type of a system. So standards gain a lot of support and are not actually very controversial with most parents in the United States. Now, of course, most parents have not experienced a strong accountability system, so maybe they would be less in favor if they experienced them. Here is the state of affairs in the United States right now for standards-based accountability. So the very dark states here are the states that not only use standardized testing to have an accountability system, but also report to parents in something like a school report card how well their school is doing. So everyone in Texas gets a school report card and has for some time, and that reports results on the TOS. The lighter blue states are the states that have report cards but don't include any test scores in the report card. So instead, the report card would only include information, say, on how many teachers were in the system or what average class size was in the school. And even amongst the dark states, most of these states do not actually have any rewards or penalties built into their system. So there are very few high-stakes systems actually in the United States. What you want to think of right now is that the United States has standards that are largely about providing information to parents. Here are the states that recognize good schools. Those are the ones that are in the dark red, and the ones that are in the light red are, the ones that are in the light red are the states that recognize good schools, and the dark states are the ones that actually reward good schools, at least somewhat, for doing well in their accountability systems. So again, you'll see that the majority of states are really doing nothing along these lines, and that there are only a few that are rewarding schools for doing well on standardized tests. Well, there are two criticisms that people have about standardized testing in the United States and standards-based accountability. And I must say that I was originally quite a skeptic of standardized testing. And I've been converted, I think, for two reasons. And let me tell you the two basic reasons. One is that it looks like states that have been doing standardized testing have actually improved in achievement faster than states that have not been doing standardized testing. And I will tell you about those results in just 1 minute. The other is that standardized testing is by far the least expensive school reform in the United States. One way to think about it is that it costs about as much to implement a standardized testing program in a state as to reduce class size by about 1/10,000th of a student per teacher. Okay? So there's a very big difference in how much standardized testing costs compared to other school reforms in the United States. Let me tell you a little bit about standardized testing here. The per student cost of all standardized testing in the United States in the last school year was $4.60, and this included all the monetary costs of standardized testing. And if you look just at the achievement testing, the cost was under $2 per student. And that, of course, does not include the cost of the value of students' time. That's the only thing I didn't try and include. You'll also notice that there are three big standardized test makers in the United States: Harcourt Brace, Houghton Mifflin, and McGraw-Hill. The within-school correlation among these major firms' standardized tests is about 0.92. Now this means that although different states use different standardized tests, since they all basically buy them from the same publishers, it doesn't matter a great deal whether different states are using somewhat different standardized tests. In fact, we're able to learn a lot about different states' progress relative to one another simply by looking at each state's standardized testing regime. Now, a slide that I'm not able to show you because it's only on my computer and not on the transparencies is what happened in the states that began doing school report cards with testing in the early 1990s versus those that have only adopted it recently. Well, it turns out that if you look at their progress on the National Assessment of Educational Progress, the states that began doing standardized testing with school report cards early in the 1990s increased their reading scores and their math scores by about 1/4 of a point on the NAEP per year faster than the other states. So that over 10 years, their NAEP scores have risen by about 2.5 points. And this is the equivalent of reducing class size by about 2 to 3 students in the United States. So it's not a huge gain, but it is a sizable gain relative to another school reform that we might consider, and that is approximately 160% more expensive. The other complaint that people talk a lot about with standardized testing and standards-based reform is that students will be diverted from doing more worthwhile tasks. Now, I couldn't agree more. If your child is doing advanced level work and the standardized test is only testing him on basic material. But one thing to remember about American schools is that the proficiency of our students is very low on many things that we might think are basic skills. This shows you mathematics proficiency of 17-year-olds. The yellow bar shows the number of 17-year-olds who can do beginning problem solving. The pink bars show you the share who can handle moderately complex procedures and reasoning. And the blue bars, which in some cases you can barely see, show students who can handle multi-step problems such as algebra. Well, given the fact that we have so few students as 17-year-olds who are achieving what we would consider to be a proficient level of mathematics, it's difficult to see how testing them on basic mathematics skills is going to be a bad thing. It's one thing if you're deterring them from learning higher level calculus, but given the fact that very few of them are able to do the sort of algebra that is tested by these tests, I think it's a false worry to worry too much about students being deterred from doing very valuable things. If you look at reading proficiency, you see a quite similar pattern. The small blue bars on the right are the share of 17-year-olds who can understand and summarize relatively complicated material. And this would certainly be the level of proficiency that's required to go on to get a college education in the United States. Again, if you have a lot of people who are not reaching a basic level of proficiency, these standardized tests are probably doing a good job of helping them to reach those levels of proficiency, even if not higher ones. Now, my own feeling about standardized, the problems with standardized testing that remain are twofold. One is that it's very difficult to give a system of rewards and penalties to students across a state. And that's because it's very difficult to control for background differences between students. And a state really needs to be able to do this and be able to do this in a clever, factual, and accurate way if it's going to be giving out rewards based on standardized tests. That turns out to be a very difficult problem, and one which we probably will not be able to solve in the next 5 to 7 years. So it's not inappropriate to give small rewards and not big rewards or penalties based on standardized testing. The other thing that I think one needs to be aware of with standardized testing is that parents are much more able to use standardized tests well than the state is. Why? Because parents, one, only use standardized tests as one of the ways in which they evaluate a school. Parents are more holistic. They look at standardized tests, they look at how well their child is doing, they look at what his friends are doing, they look at what homework he's doing. So the parents, this is only one of the pieces of information that they use. The other good thing about standardized testing from the point of view of parents is that parents don't need to try and figure out how much is my school's achievement better than another school's achievement that's very, very different in terms of neighborhood and family background. Parents don't really worry about that. Very few parents who live in an affluent suburb are thinking to themselves, should I move into an inner city neighborhood and send my children to schools there? That's really not the sort of comparison most parents need to make. What most parents do is they compare their schools to neighboring schools or schools in neighborhoods that are similar to theirs. Those don't require these very difficult, complex procedures to try and control for family background the way the state does. So my feeling is that using standardized tests, parents are probably better users at this point than the state is even. Now the other school reform, of course, that's in play is school choice in the United States. And let me just show you first that even whether people support or don't support school choice is somewhat controversial in the United States. It depends a lot on how you ask the question. You can see here are the results of 5 different polls asking people whether they support or don't support school vouchers or charter schools or school choice. You can see that some of them look like people are in favor of school choice and some of them are not in favor of school choice. Well, it largely depends on the wording of the question. What do we conclude when we see people's answers depend a lot on the wording of a question? We conclude that people don't completely understand what this reform is about and they're confused, and therefore exactly how the question is worded affects the way that they answer the question. So I think school choice in the United States is still really a reform in its infancy that many people don't understand and that we're just getting used to. There are 2 major types of school choice reforms in the US. The first is charter schools, and most of you will have heard about them. So there are just a few more than 2,000 charter schools, this year. But last year, there were only about 1,600, and the year before, there were only about 800. In fact, I used to do an annual charter school survey, but it's gotten too expensive for me to do because there are so many more charter schools than there were before. Charter schools still account for less than 0.5% of total US K-12 enrollment. And charter schools differ a bit from state to state, but they always have in common the feature that they are funded by public monies, and that each student brings with him the equivalent of a voucher or a tuition coupon that is funded from tax revenue, just like public schools would be. As a rule, this coupon or this sort of voucher that's brought to the charter school is between 40 and 100% of local regular per pupil spending, usually a good deal less than 100% of regular per pupil spending. In many states, charter schools are not able to compete effectively with their local districts because the district, in fact, is the grantor of the charter, so that a charter school that competes too effectively is not very popular. This shows you the way charter school enrollment looks in the United States. Ignore that big yellow star for a moment. It looks like the lone star state of California, I'm afraid. What this shows you are states that have at least 1% of their enrollment in charter schools. Those are the light blue states. And states that have more than 1% of their enrollment in charter schools are the dark blue states. And the two states that have the most enrollment in charter schools are Arizona, where charter schools are allowed to be very competitive with public schools, and Michigan. The states that have little X's or that big yellow star in the state of California show the states in which charter schools are not chartered by their local districts, so they are able to compete relatively effectively. It's important, though, to keep in mind that this is still a very small reform, really nascent. The other type of big school choice reform that's in play is publicly funded vouchers. Oops, not succeeding in showing that to you. There we go. And you will have heard of some of these plans. In Florida, there is now a voucher plan for schools that are failing public schools. But in fact, the vouchers have really been almost not exercised at all in private schools in the state of Florida because of constitutionality issues. In Cleveland, the Cleveland voucher program has also recently been declared unconstitutional, but it's been moving back and forth in the courts over the years. And there, the voucher is about $2,250, whereas local per pupil spending is about $8,000. So that gives you a sense of the relative size of the voucher relative to the local public schools. And Milwaukee has the largest public voucher program in the United States. The vouchers there fund about 8,000 students who receive vouchers of up to $5,000. All of these students are poor, close to the poverty line, and the Milwaukee Public School District spends about $8,800 a year per pupil. There are also some very tiny voucher programs in the state of Maine and Vermont. Now, what do we know about the effects of these voucher programs and charter school programs? Well, there are a variety of questions we would like to have answered. And let me try and pick out the two major questions that people have. The first question is, will public schools compete effectively? Can they respond in some positive, constructive way when they're faced with competition from a charter school or a voucher school? And the second big question that people have is, what's going to happen to the sorting of students among schools? And often this question is asked in the following way. Are the voucher schools or the charter schools going to cream skim off all the best students and take them away, leaving the remaining public schools with a poor population of students who have academic troubles or who have very unmotivated families? So those are the two types of questions that we need to answer. Now, it turns out that there are two ways to go about answering these questions. There's the long-term view and the short-term view. So let me tell you about the long-term view first. And here again, I'm sorry, I can't show you this slide because it's just on my computer. We're having these technical problems. You can ask the question, well, in the long term, are public school districts that have had to compete a lot with other public school districts, are they high productivity, high achievement districts, or are they low productivity, low achievement districts? Does it make any difference whether they have to compete with other public school districts? Now, this is something where you can look at the long-term answer to the question, because actually there are metropolitan areas in the United States that have many, many public school districts where they've had to compete for a long time with other school districts. And there are other metropolitan areas where there's only one public school district for the entire metropolitan area. Let me give you a couple of examples. In Pittsburgh and in Boston and in Minneapolis, there are about 100 public school districts in the metropolitan area. That means that a parent has a lot of ability to move to another public school district if they think that there's better achievement or better productivity in that other district. In areas like Miami, Florida, there's only one public school district for the entire metropolitan area, and it's a much larger metropolitan area than Boston or Minneapolis or Pittsburgh. Okay, so this shows that there are big differences among different metropolitan areas. Well, does it matter which of these types of metropolitan areas you live in? It turns out that the answer is yes. In the long term, if you compare these different types of metropolitan areas, the metropolitan areas in which public school districts have to compete more with one another have higher achievement and have lower per pupil spending once you control for the income of the community and the racial composition of the metropolitan area and so forth and so on. This suggests that public schools really can respond positively to competition and can be more productive. The same thing happens if you look at public schools that have had to compete a lot with private schools. Now, again, there's a lot of long-term historical difference in whether a public schools in an area have to compete with private schools or not. There are some metropolitan areas where about 22% of students are enrolled in private schools, and private schools tend to be very inexpensive because they were endowed a long time ago by religious institutions. And there are other metropolitan areas where there's almost no competition for the public schools from private schools. If you compare these two different types of metropolitan areas, you'll see that the public schools in the metropolitan areas where they face more competition from private schools have significantly higher achievement by about 10%. So it's not a small difference in achievement. And I think that's important. The other type of evidence we have is how have public schools responded to these recent reforms, like the charter schools and the vouchers. So one voucher program that we can look at, because it's pretty big, is this Milwaukee voucher. And the Milwaukee voucher was started in 1980, but it didn't become very big until it started in 1990, and it didn't become very big until the 1998-99 school year, when it was allowed to expand a great deal. If you look at how much the Milwaukee public schools improved before and after the voucher program, you can see a very big change in the rate of school improvement in the Milwaukee public schools after the voucher program was expanded, and then again another surge of improvement in achievement after the voucher program was allowed to expand and become much more competitive. For instance, in math, Milwaukee public schools increased their math scores by about 7 national percentile points in the 3 years after the voucher program was allowed to expand. This was more than they had improved their math scores in the previous 20 years. And I'm not claiming that this surge in achievement will last forever, but it does suggest that public schools, just like other organizations, are able to respond positively to competition when they face it. Michigan and Arizona I mentioned as the two states that have a lot of charter schools, and there you can look at schools that had to face a lot of competition from local charter schools. For instance, in Detroit, although only 2.5% of Michigan's public school students are enrolled in charter schools, Detroit has about 15% of its students enrolled in charter schools because it's really been targeted by charter schools. It was a low-performing district before. Well, in districts like Detroit, where they've had to face increasing competition from charter schools, math scores and reading scores have risen by about 3 national percentile points since the charter schools reached about 5% of enrollment. And again, that's a very impressive show of improvement for a district like Detroit, which has really seen very little improvement in achievement for a long period of time, and suddenly has had a little burst of improvement in the last few years. I think it's early days yet to try and assess the effects of all of this competition on public schools in places like Arizona and Michigan, but it's not too early to see that at least the initial effect is positive. Now, I wanted to get to the other question that people ask, and that is this question about how charter schools and voucher schools, or school choice in general, is going to change the allocation of students between schools. So the first thing that we need to think about is, well, what is the reality about public schools now in the United States? People are often not very realistic. They have this idea that public schools are very, very heterogeneous, and they're all basically like a random draw from the student population in the United States. And if we were to introduce school choice, we would end up with much more segregation. Well, That may be true, but we need to be realistic about the baseline. The reality is that public schools in the United States are already very segregated along the lines of income and race and have been for a long time. And I want to show you a few things about this, just so that we start off with a baseline that's realistic. This is black-white dissimilarity of schools in the United States. And let me tell you the simple way to look at this chart. If every state schools were to look like the population of that state, okay? If every state schools were to look like the population of that state, all of these states would be clear. They would all be white, uncolored, okay? The darker the state is, the less its schools look like the population of that state. In other words, the more segregated they are relative to what the population of the state looks like. So you can see that black-white dissimilarity is very high throughout the Northeast, the Rust Belt, and down here in the Southeast, and again in California. We basically have quite racially segregated schools in the United States right now. We need to keep this in mind. This is the baseline. We're only going to be able to make so much progress relative to this baseline when we start with school choice. Similarly, if you look at poverty dissimilarity of schools in the United States, pure public schooling has not gotten us all that far. This is just like the chart of black-white dissimilarity. Again, if every school had the same income distribution or the same poverty distribution as its state, all of these states would be clear. And you can see that many of them are very dark. The dissimilarity index shows that they're very different from their state as a whole, especially the Northeast. You'll notice California again, and a bit of the Southeast. Okay? So public schools are not all homogeneous in the United States. They do tend to be segregated. The other thing that's worth noting is that we have tried in the US to use command and control mechanisms to create less segregation in schools, both along the lines of racial desegregation and income desegregation. And these command and control mechanisms have not worked very well for us. I mean, everyone knows about desegregation plans, but one interesting chart here, and I want you to, this is a bit, I'm afraid this would be a lot better if the colors were coming out stronger. You need to look at two lines here in particular. The first one is the one that says % white. I don't know if, can everyone see that pretty clearly? Okay, that's going down. And then there's one that says exposure of blacks to whites. It's that one, sort of in the middle. It has an arrow. And I'm sorry you can't see these better. They should all be very different colors. Well, the line there is showing you when desegregation plans took place in American schools. And you'll notice that what happened, here's the desegregation plan taking effect. This is the history before the desegregation plans. This is all the schools, all the cities that had desegregation orders in the United States. The immediate effect on the exposure of blacks to whites and the exposure of whites to blacks was quite strong. But over time, what happened was that whites moved out of districts that had desegregation court orders. And you can see that the % white line slowly moving down across the entire graph. And by the end of the time period, 20 years after these desegregation court orders, the exposure of blacks to whites and whites to blacks was no better than it had been in the beginning, and in most places was worse. Right? This suggests that command and control mechanisms have not worked terribly well for us in trying to improve segregation in the United States. Now, one of the things I like about as an opportunity with school choice is that school choice gives us an opportunity to use not command and control mechanisms, but what I would describe as price mechanisms to try and, at a minimum, keep student allocation, student segregation across schools as good as it is now, and certainly not let it get any worse, while still getting some of the productivity benefits we associate with school choice. So let me give you a few examples to try and make this concrete. All right, so here are two, start with a straightforward example. One of the things people worry about is that a voucher might leave behind all the special education kids in an area because they are more expensive to educate. Well, it is possible to have a voucher that takes account of that. In that case, you would have a voucher that was equal to the regular education voucher plus a supplement that was a student-specific additional That had to do with the cost of implementing the special education student's individual education plan. Now, this is something we don't have in the current system. It is not true that if you have a special education child who's expensive to educate, that you can take that child's funding, which is going to be higher than a regular education funding, and go around to different schools and say, look, here's this amount, here's this pot of money associated with my child. Where can I get my child the best education? You cannot do that. That money's not really associated with your child. It belongs to the district. Okay? And if you move your child to another district, you're not assured of being able to take that sort of money with your child. That's something you can do very easily with a voucher. It's not difficult at all. Another problem is, how do you encourage schools to stay in the desegregation range of current schools in the area if you put in a voucher plan? Well, again, that's relatively easy to do with a voucher. You can have a voucher where you start with a regular education voucher and then you have a penalty. And the key is that the penalty needs to be a function of the difference between how segregated the school is and or what the racial composition of the area is. So let me give you an example. Let's say you have an area and it's 70% white and 30% black. And that's what you want all the schools in the area to look something like that. You want to encourage them to look like that. That's how the desegregation plan is supposed to work right now. Well, what you do is you have a voucher such that as a school moves away from that target, 70-30, the voucher gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. That means that if you have a school that's 80-20, it needs to move towards the target in order to have the maximum voucher. And if you have a school that's 60-40, it also needs to move towards the target. So you're going to have two schools approach the target, both in order to get the highest possible voucher. That's an example of a price mechanism that can be used to solve student sorting problems. So I don't think we should be pessimistic about the combining school choice with the ability to solve some social problems in the United States. I think we should be optimistic and think about many of the good ways that school choice enables us to expand the sorts of policies that we can consider. Just to finish up, I want to return to this idea that school choice and school accountability perhaps go together and really should not be separated from one another. I talked about improvements in achievement in Michigan, Arizona, and Milwaukee, Wisconsin. In all of these three places, not only was there a school choice plan in effect, but there was also an accountability system in effect, so that when parents were making choices among schools in those areas, they were in fact influenced by the achievement record of schools. They weren't doing it just on the basis of superficial characteristics of the schools. And it may be that one of the reasons why we're seeing some of this improvement and a good reaction to school choice is precisely that parents are getting new information. I also think that American parents are good at being consumers, and that they will become more sophisticated consumers when they have more choice and more information on which to base their choices. I think these two types of reforms are very complementary to one another, and in fact, I wouldn't want to go down one path without going down the other. Well, I think there are a couple of things. Maybe I should repeat the question just to make sure that everyone heard it. Asked about the fact that less educated, lower income parents might be less likely to take up school choice plans than more educated, more affluent parents, and pointing out that in Europe this had been a bias of some of the school choice availability there, that the more affluent parents were more likely to make use of these plans. I think there are a couple of things you want to do. One is you do not want a the ideal should not be a very small school choice plan that only 1,000 kids in a district get to take advantage of or something like that. When we really think about school choice, it should be offered universally so everyone can take advantage of it. And you don't have to be the most motivated parent who gets down there the first day, the first person in line in order to take advantage of it. So I think that's one clear thing. The other is that there are two reasons to think that American parents will be a little different than European parents. One is that well-off American parents already have a great deal of school choice in many metropolitan areas, and that's because they choose among schools and they choose among school districts and they figure out where to live based on what school they want to send their children to. So it is mainly less affluent parents who are trapped in big city districts where they don't feel very happy and they don't feel that they can move, and they don't have any other residential choices, who will want to take advantage of school choice plans. And in fact, I think that's why we've seen in most of these experimental school choice plans that parents are pretty good at trying to take advantage of them. Even poor parents, many of whom are on welfare, for instance, in the New York City school choice plan. But the other thing is that I think you actually want to have a system that encourages everyone to make use of it. So in some of the cities that have intra-district school choice plans, all parents are basically forced to make a choice. Now, I'm not saying that every parent makes a wise choice the first year, because I think many people don't, and they sort of make the default choice. They don't really think through it. But after several years, most of these intra-district school choice plans have found that even parents who were not very motivated to think about it in the first place become motivated to think about it, because they realize, well, you know, they're making a choice for me if I don't make a choice for myself, and I'd rather make a choice for myself if I have to make a choice. So I think that parents would gradually get used to this idea that they need to make a choice. I think Americans are good at being consumers and they're bad at being told what to do. And I don't want to say bad things about Europeans, but I'm not sure that the same type of consumer mentality really holds throughout European sort of social income classes.
Have you done any studies on the special education students and how much of the productivity decline has been associated with mainstreaming of the special ed students?
Well, it is relatively easy to figure out how much of the increase in cost in the US over the past 30 years has been associated with special education students. It's about 25% of the total increase in per pupil spending in real terms. So that would suggest also that about 25% of the decrease in productivity was just due directly to increasing spending on special education students. Mainstreaming in particular, it's a little bit difficult to know, because mainstreaming is not always associated with spending more on special education children, partly because the children who are most likely to be mainstreamed are the least expensive special education kids. They tend to be the kids with mild learning disabilities as opposed to kids with very severe physical disabilities. So I don't know what the right answer to that question is, but it's probably upwards of 25%, maybe 30%, something like that, based on the number I told you before. Mm-hmm.
I am currently enrolled in an education class, and part of the discussion has been about this issue. And one of the problems that comes up is that of transportation. That children, even though they have choice, the school district only provides transportation within their neighborhood school. So if they choose a school outside of their neighborhood, they have to provide their own transportation. So would that issue be addressed somehow?
Well, I think the goal is to have that issue be addressed. Now, obviously, no school choice plan is going to say we will transport you to any school in the United States regardless of the distance, but transportation plans can be more flexible, and students can be given transportation vouchers as part of a voucher. If you look at a state like Arizona, where they have a lot of charter schools now, charter schools are given a transportation budget in the same way that public schools are, and the charter schools send out buses and pick up kids, and they don't seem to have a great deal of trouble with this. And Arizona is a pretty spread out state where people drive a lot, so it's not all these kids are not walking to school. So I think it basically can be solved if you're willing to have a voucher or a charter school fee that is not that different from what public schools spend now, because then there's enough room for a transportation budget. Of course, a charter school might still refuse to pick up a child if the child lived very far away, but I think for reasonably local kids, it's not that big a problem.
The transportation system might also be drawn into that with some kind of student pass or something where they get free transport to school.
That often happens in school choice programs that are in a city. So Washington, D.C.'s charter schools do that. The Boston charter schools do that. Charter schools I know in Philadelphia do that. They're using public transport as well. So, but I think that's really a pretty urban phenomenon.
I'd like to ask about the.
You showed a chart right at the beginning where the student performance was just a horizontal line, but school spending was shooting up.
Yes.
I was wondering where that money is going. What we're investing in now that we weren't 20 years ago.
Well, we don't really know the answer to that question, I think is the problem. I can tell you some of the things that we know have happened to the money, but that we don't totally understand. So part of it is that we have smaller class size, which costs a lot of money actually. Every time you reduce class size by 10% in the United States, it costs about $800 per student. So that is an expensive policy. And as we get down to having quite small class sizes, a 10% reduction is only 2 students, from 20. So it doesn't seem like a very big reduction in class size, 20 to 18, but it costs about $800 per student. So that's one thing it has gone to. Another thing it has gone to is, as I've mentioned, it has gone to some increase in special education spending. Another thing it's gone to is increasing the share of professional staff in schools who are not classroom teachers. And this has particularly been an acute change in some not very well functioning big school districts, where almost half of the professional staff in this school district will be non-classroom teachers. They'll be doing other things. Now, we don't completely know what all these people are doing, I think is part of the problem. Mm-hmm.
Everybody knows that the teachers' unions have been big opponents to school choice. Do you have any comment on how a school choice plan can be designed to overcome some of the objections of teachers' unions?
Well, I like to think about 2 different groups, the teachers and the teachers' unions. I think you can design a school choice plan that will be liked by teachers. I'm not sure you can design a school choice plan that's going to be liked by teachers' unions. I think those may be 2 different things. If I were a teacher, I would be excited about school choice. At least I hope I would be a good teacher. Maybe I wouldn't be. But if I were a good teacher, I would be excited about school choice for the following reason. School choice is going to make schools more desirous of having good teachers on their faculty, because they're going to realize these are the teachers who draw parents in, who keep parents happy, who make sure the parents go to our school instead of another school. That means that those sorts of teachers are going to end up getting paid more, given more desirable duties, get more responsibility in the schools, and that's what we've seen happen in charter schools, especially in Arizona, where we know a lot about what's happening in the charter schools. And about 50%, by the way, of new teachers in Arizona go into teaching in charter schools because the charter schools are growing so fast. The charter schools allow much more salary diversity than the regular public system does, and they pay good teachers more than the regular public system. It's not clear that they pay everybody more, but they're paying the good teachers more. They often start with the same salary scale, and after a few years they realize, look, this teacher is really important to our school. We've got to keep her. We're willing to pay her more. They're also willing to pay teachers who are in shortage areas like math and science teaching more than the regular public schools are. So a lot of teachers should like, I think, school choice. If I were a teacher and I wanted to have a more professionalized occupation, I wanted to have more opportunity for salary growth over time, I think I would like school choice. I think it would be good for the teaching profession. It's not clear that the unions are going to like that, because no union really likes to have a lot of diversity amongst how its members are treated, because that makes it very hard to run a political organization like a union. But so I'm not sure you can make both constituencies happy. Mm-hmm. I think there's a mic coming to you right here.
I know you said earlier that there wasn't any large-scale, I guess, testing of this, but what about Fisk and Ladd's report on New Zealand? I mean, they've basically turned over their entire education system to choice, and it seems like from their book that their report seems pretty pessimistic, like in terms of achievement and making the schools more, I guess, egalitarian.
Well, I don't know, because there isn't quantitative analysis in that book. It's more sort of qualitative, and I haven't visited New Zealand schools, so I've heard conflicting things. I had a bunch of people from New Zealand who sat in my office and told me the book was completely wrong, and I've read the book, so I'm not sure what I think I just don't know, I think is my answer. I've heard some people say it was not an accurate characterization. Some people say it was accurate. I guess my answer is I just don't know what the right answer is about New Zealand. Some people say it's just a badly designed school choice plan, and some people say that their characterization of what happened in New Zealand is inaccurate. I just don't know. That's my answer.
You show the comparison of school expenditures by nation.
Yes.
And then performance by nation. And I wonder, are those numbers corrected for indigenous costs of living?
Well, we don't have the highest costs of living, actually, of these European
For example,
countries.
I mean, Hungary was a little nub on the left-hand side of the expenditure, and it was way on the right-hand side. Lunch is very cheap in Hungary, too. I just got back from there.
Well, Hungary is certainly, Hungary's kind of on the edge of being a European
the answer
nation.
is it wasn't a correction.
There isn't a correction. European countries, there were a variety there. Some of them have higher costs of living than we do, France, the Scandinavian countries, and so forth. And some of them have somewhat, as you pointed out, Hungary has lower costs of living. I think, though, that adjusting for cost of living isn't going to get us that far, because since we actually have a lower cost of living, significantly so than some of those other European countries. So if we'd made the adjustment, I think we'd look a little worse.
But the major variations were not over on the right-hand side, which is where the Western European countries were. What made that chart impressive was the large gradient from the left.
Oh,
to the right.
I think actually just the difference between us and our next nearest neighbor is pretty impressive. So we're spending $1,000 more per capita, more than $1,000 more, about $1,200 more per capita than our next nearest neighbor in Europe. And that next nearest neighbor is a Scandinavian country that has higher costs of living than we do.
That difference, you really need to understand where the money's going.
Yeah, this is the big puzzle. The puzzle in the United States is not achievement, because in some sense nothing's happening to achievement. So how can this be a big puzzle? The puzzle is, where is all this money going? If we're so willing to spend money on education, why is it we aren't improving education? And I think that's we have to solve that problem, I think, if we're going to have a knowledge-based economy.
I just want to follow up. One follow up on the provost's question, because there has been a lot of disaggregating of those kinds of numbers of costs, and David Berliner at Arizona State is one of the people who's done that. And what shows up in the U.S. is costs, very often non-expenditure dollars, because we don't have a national health care system. The health care costs of all the school employees show up in our education budgets. Transportation was raised earlier. Most of those countries, the transportation costs of transporting students is shown up in their transportation budget and not in their others. So the question of where a lot of this money goes to, a lot of that, certainly we saw the doubling of energy costs in the 70s that skewed the costs. We're going to see that in California again this year. And what will appear to be a spike in education costs is really keeping the schools warm and cool. So the question that he asked is, I think, a really important one that's even beyond the cost of living, and that is that we pay for a lot of things under our education budgets that are not instructional. The other, on the international comparisons on the TIMSS data, if you take an aggregate of American kids, we appear to be quite low. If you disaggregate just by family income, our middle class and upper middle class kids score with the top 3 countries. Our poor kids score with the third world country. So what we really need to look at is the inequities and not so much the aggregate.
Actually, I want to respond to some of those things. First of all, remember that chart was CPI adjusted, so there was the increase in the price of oil was already taken out there. So price increases have been taken out of that. That's all CPI adjusted. The price of oil is one of the major constituent parts of the consumer price index. So that's already taken out. It is true that some healthcare costs would be included in American benefits to employees. employee salaries account for about 40% of a typical education budget, and the total cost of benefits are about 15% on top of those salaries. So that would get you a little ways, but we're talking maybe 3 or 4%, not the big differences that we see between these countries. I think one of the things that is discouraging about the TIMSS data and about the NAEP data over the past 30 years, the NAEP is the National Assessment of Educational Progress, is yes, there are huge disparities in how well American kids do on these tests. It's not that no American kids do as well as European kids. Of course, we have affluent kids, they do very well on the tests. But this is a period of time over which we have changed spending a lot in the United States and have directed it more and more with each passing year towards disadvantaged kids, which I think is a great thing. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. But the problem is that their achievement has not risen over the past 30 years. If you look at the National Assessment of Educational Progress scores for students whose parents are high school dropouts, for students who are black, for students who are Hispanic, for students who come from low-income families, their NAEP scores are very flat too. And this is a period of time during which school districts that serve poor children have had an increase in spending that has been about 75% faster than that of the average district. So it makes sense that we're trying to direct more resources towards poor kids. I think that's a great thing, but what we want to see is direct more resources there and see their scores go up and start to approach those of more affluent kids in the United States. So definitely this problem is about kids from low-income households, disadvantaged households. I agree with you. But those are also some of the children whose parents right now have the least choice, the least ability to influence their schools, the least ability to get out of a bad school if they don't think their school is performing well. They're not necessarily parents whose kids are not having a lot of money spent on them. It's worth keeping in mind that the Washington, D.C. public schools spend in the 99th percentile in the United States. They are one of the top spending school districts in the entire United States, and the average student in Washington, D.C. scores at the 8th percentile on the National Assessment of Educational Progress. And that tells you have a lot of poor parents there who have more money being spent on their kids in school than they have in disposable income each year, and they do not have schools that are doing very much for them. And those parents are, some of the reason why I think we have unhappy results here. And they need to be given more opportunities.
I wanted to ask about religious issue in Milwaukee. As I remember, the voucher movement really got its start on the near north side of Milwaukee in around 1 or 2 Catholic schools, and I think, in fact, the woman who spearheaded it was a black female.
Congresswoman, yeah.
But the issue that they got snagged on was the religious issue in the state Supreme Court, and you say Ohio has also said that's constitutional. Where does that issue stand nationally? Is that going to be a roadblock, do you think?
I think it's a Supreme Court issue now. My understanding is that someone in the room who's a constitutional lawyer can tell me I'm wrong here, but my understanding is that when 2 state Supreme Courts come to very different decisions on exactly the same piece of the U.S. Constitution, that the Supreme Court is almost obliged to hear that case. Right now, the Wisconsin Supreme Court has said that it is constitutional to allow religious schools to be in the voucher plan, and the Ohio Supreme Court has said that it's not, basically. So it looks like this is moving to the Supreme Court. I don't know what will be the outcome.
One of the most disturbing things to me when I read these international comparisons, however they are made, is that in the early years of schooling, our students seem to do pretty well compared to European and Asian countries, but the longer they stay in school, the worse the comparison becomes. Does that square with the evidence that you've reviewed?
Well, I think the problems in American schooling are more concentrated in grades 8 through 12 than they are in the earlier grades. Almost everybody thinks that's true. I mean, parents tend to think that that's true, and we see very little progress in American achievement once you get into grade 8. There are some kids who achieve marvelous things in high school, but there are many kids who don't seem to pick up very much once they get into the high school years. So that would be consistent, I think, with the evidence. And there are some people who think that part of the problem is that there are a lot of children in the United States who do not have very strong incentives to achieve in high school, and that the schools don't have very strong incentives to make sure they achieve. Now, this is kind of prior to this sort of accountability movement where now we have a lot of these high school kids being tested. But the regime for years and years has been that if you went to an affluent school, in an affluent school district, you cared a lot about doing well in high school. Why? Because you wanted to go to a selective college. But that was the goal. You wanted to do well on college admissions tests, you wanted to take AP courses, you wanted to take achievement tests. That you had some strong incentives. But if you didn't want to go to a selective college at all, you were just happy to go to your local community college, which doesn't tend to use any of these things, you had very weak incentives to do well in high school. I think the standards movement is changing that a little bit because it's putting testing in for everybody, not just 10 or 15% of American kids.
If I understand it correctly, your measure of educational output was performance on standardized tests. Does that create a difficulty in measuring the effect of bringing in standardized tests, in that you're sort of measuring your output by the same instrument you're trying to evaluate? And if so, are there alternative measures of output other than performance on these standardized tests?
Well, there are some, so let me say a little bit about this. One of the things that we like to do is we like to use this National Assessment of Educational Progress because it's very consistent over time and see what happens as the state implements its own standardized testing regime. Does it do better on the National Assessment of Educational Progress? But you are correct. What if kids were only doing better on standardized testing and they were doing worse on everything else? It's a little hard to know. We know that we do have some other outcomes. One of the other things we use are wages. So we look at people's wages later in life. We look at the probability that they go on to college, that they graduate from college, that they go on to graduate school, things like that. So there are a variety of other outcomes we can use. The problem with some of these other outcomes is that you have to wait a long time, right? So if you want to evaluate a school reform that's happening today, you don't want to wait until the kids are 32, which is the first age at which we think we can evaluate them on the basis of wages really well. Because by then, these school reforms will have passed us by. So we do kind of have to rely on standardized tests, especially for these short-term outcomes or studying these reforms. I told you a little bit about if we compare metropolitan areas that have had different amounts of choice for long periods of time, there we can see the effects not just in standardized testing, but in the percent who go on to college, the percent who graduate from college, and in wages. Because those are really long-term experiments. These metropolitan areas have been different for a long time. So it does look like it's more outcomes, but we just don't know that about new things.
You mentioned earlier that the European countries with which U.S. students are being compared have a lot of high-stakes testing programs that permanently eliminate some students from entering higher levels. How do you, I'm sure some studies must have been done to try and compensate for those students' absence in the test results. What happens to the performance of U.S. students when you try and compare our population with a more equal kind of population in these other countries?
Well, that's a difficult thing. Now, what I showed you actually was comparing American students to these other students at around age 12 or 13. At around age 12 and 13, all European students are still in school. So this is not a problem, and that's why I showed you those earlier grades. By the time you get out to age 17, it is not true that all European students are still in school. Some of them have moved on to training programs, they're in vocational schools, or they're just out of school altogether. And then we really just don't know how to do the comparison exactly right. So that's why I showed you the earlier. I don't know the answer to how you would compare 17-year-olds. Some of them are just not in school. So it's hard to know exactly which Americans would have been the ones who wouldn't be in school in Europe.
I'm saying the problem is with the 17-year-olds. We're using data for the 12-year-olds, and it seems to me that we don't have quite a match between them.
Well, I think that by age 12, we're already not doing so well compared to these European countries. It might be that if we could somehow figure out how all these Europeans would be doing at age 17, maybe we would make gains relative to them. If we look at the 17-year-olds in Europe versus 17-year-olds in the US, the gap has widened, but you're correct that some of that is probably due to the fact that some European students have kind of dropped out of the school system who wouldn't have dropped out in the US. And we just don't know that much about 17-year-olds. I think we can talk about 13-year-olds, 12-year-olds pretty easily.
You mentioned that as we have more charter schools, we're going to need more competitive teachers and better teachers. And I was wondering what your thoughts are on increasing teacher salaries as a policy option and how feasible or how compatible that is with the school choice option.
Well, I think increasing teacher salaries is important. If you want good people to be teachers, then you have to pay them salaries that are commensurate with other alternative wage opportunities they have. There is a twofold problem, though, with increasing teacher salaries. It's not just a matter of you want to increase the teacher salaries for everyone across the board. You want to increase the teacher salaries for teachers who are good and who have good outside job opportunities. Those are not all teachers, right? That's the way the rest of America tends to pay its workers. And I think right now what we have is a problem where when teacher salaries get increased, most of the beneficiaries are incumbent teachers, and the incumbent teachers, some of them are good teachers and some of them are not so good teachers, but the benefits of the teacher salary increase get spread over both good and bad teachers, so it's not really improving the pool as much as the pool of teachers as much as you might think it would be if it were more targeted. I think if we had more targeted teacher salary increases, it would be quite feasible to pay the teachers who are good higher salaries. I think it's quite difficult to do if you want to just pay across the board
How likely
increases.
do you think that it would be to adopt a plan where you are rewarding the teachers that have shown to be better?
I think under school choice it's pretty easy, because if you think about a school choice school, its budget depends on how many kids it can attract, right? So in some ways it has to start paying attention to which teachers are good at attracting parents, making parents happy, keeping parents in the school. And school choice schools tend to sort of move naturally towards paying teachers more who are more, better teachers. It's going to be a very hard thing for some public schools to do that. But I've also heard superintendents tell me that they were glad that they had some competition from school choice schools in their district now, because one of the things it had allowed them to do was that it had allowed them to go and argue to their union, look, these are the types of teachers who are leaving to go to this choice school. We have to be able to retain them. The only way we can retain them is by offering our best teachers some bonuses or some ways to. So I think it can be done, but I think you probably need some incentives to get schools to change the way they're doing things. They're very set in their ways.
What bearing would school choice have on the issue of local finance versus more centralized forms of finance?
Oh, that is a complicated question. The question was, what bearing would school choice have on local finance versus state finance? That's almost such a complicated question that I don't want to answer it. I can see President Gillis looking at me here because he's a public finance person and he's interested in the answer. It's a very tough question. School choice makes it a little bit difficult to not have some centralized funding of schools. In particular, parts of a voucher that you would want to be add-ons, for instance, for special education, or parts of a voucher that you would want to be add-ons that would take care of desegregation issues, things like that, almost have to be from centralized funding sources. Otherwise, you would end up with people who wanted to, say, move across district lines to get a better special education voucher. So I think some parts of the voucher would have to come from centralized funding. It's also important that some parts of the voucher actually come from local funding or come directly, or that parents pay something into the system. And that's because we want to retain some efficiency in the system. So it's not good to have all the money coming from third-party payers. It's important that parents have some stake in how much money their school is spending, so that they can say, you really seem to be spending too much money for the value you're giving us. And that's a kind of local thing, or something where you want parents to have some stake in it. So I've written about this, but it actually is quite a complicated issue that takes quite a long time to try and work through all the different ramifications of it.
Can you made a very appealing case for vouchers. Can you think of any costs, either financial or other kinds of costs that would be associated with these programs?
I think the biggest problems are problems that I would describe as either problems that are short-term or problems that especially occur in experimental voucher plans. So some of the experimental voucher plans start with, they'll say 1,000 students. I'm just characterizing the New York City voucher for a moment. Started with offering it to 1,000 students, and they were given about $1,000 a piece. Now, these were very poor students. Everybody was close to the poverty line. What do you do with a $1,000 voucher in New York City? Well, the only thing that you can do, and if you're poor, with a $1,000 voucher is send your kids to highly subsidized Catholic schools or other religious schools. So one thing that it did was it may have forced some parents to send their kids to religious schools who really didn't want to send their kids to religious schools, since those are the only low-cost options. It also meant that when people looked at the voucher plan, all they saw was people going to religious schools, so they said, well, this is all about religious schools, when in reality it's not clear that that's what all the parents wanted. It meant that there were some parents who couldn't top up even a little bit on top of that $1,000 voucher. So even though they could get their kid into a Catholic school, they couldn't come up with the extra $250 or $300. So the poorest families out of the group that got the voucher were sometimes not even able to exercise the voucher. Well, these are all problems. And furthermore, 1,000 kids, how much difference is that going to make to the New York City public schools, which have about 1 million kids in the system? Not a lot, right? Not a lot of difference. So I think some of these experimental voucher plans are very nice for kind of getting people to be aware of vouchers, but that's about all they're good at doing. And they often have problems built into them because they have very little funding, because they start small, that are problems that we wouldn't really want to have if we wanted to carry out these policies on a larger scale. The other thing I think that is, again, a problem with sort of startup is that you want to start a system that has the wisdom built in of years and years of kind of knowing how public schools operate. We don't want to just switch to school choice and forget about everything that we've learned about public schools and how they operate and how to fund them correctly and how to fund special. You don't want to forget about that stuff, right? You want to transfer that knowledge into the new system. But often people don't think about it that way. They think, well, are we going to have school choice, yes or no? They get very excited, they pass a school choice plan, and then they think afterwards, oh, by the way, how should we fund this thing? Well, that's really not the right way to think about it. You ought to think about how to fund it as part of the plan that you're going to pass. So I think that the risks are really associated with people passing unwise plans and not thinking through some of these issues ahead of time.
Is it possible that some of the increase in spending on education, especially recently, is accounted for by spending on technology? And if so, possibly that technical skills that may be increased by this sort of spending may not be measured on standardized tests, which were designed long before these sort of things were coming about.
Well, that's true. These standardized tests, I think, are still mainly fill in the bubble, and we don't take them on computers yet. Technology costs in U.S. schools are actually a very small share of total spending. There are some districts, especially more affluent districts, where technology spending will be a pretty sizable chunk of the budget in a given year when they try and put in a lot of computers. But it only accounts for about 2% of total U.S. public school spending. So it's kind of hard to see how this could be the main contributing factor. It's also true that U.S. public schools are not that far ahead of the technology curve. They tend to have kind of old-fashioned computers and not really be up with the latest technology.
I would think that reductions in class size would have a more positive effect in earlier grades where discipline is more likely to be a problem. Are there any studies that support that?
Well, class size is a very difficult. Let me tell you a little tiny bit about the history of the research on class size. Everyone believes that reducing class size is good for student achievement. And it's certainly true that if you reduce class size, it does give every teacher more opportunities to do things with individual students who are having problems. So it's got to be that it gives you the opportunity to do more. But the history is that research has shown that it's very difficult to show any effect of reduction in class size. So for about 20 years, there was almost no research that showed that class size mattered. And recently, a study came out of Tennessee which did a sort of experiment in class size in the grades K through 3. And it looks like class size reductions in Tennessee had small positive effects on achievement. Now, they were quite small. The reductions in class size were large, from about 24 students to 18 students a class, so big reductions. And they improved achievement by about 2/100ths of a standard deviation. And that was pretty constant, so it didn't add up it didn't accumulate over years. Now, that was a statistically significant result, so people were all excited about this. But class size reductions just don't seem to have a very big effect. My own reading of the class size reduction literature and research is what usually happens with class size reductions is someone reduces class size, gives the money to the schools, and the school says, with the class size reduction, we will improve achievement. Rarely does a policy check up to see whether the school actually did that. I'm not a person who believes that no class size reduction could ever be effective, but it just seems that they are not very effective, which suggests that probably you need to check up on schools and evaluate what they've actually done with the class size reduction and make sure that things have changed. What the class size reductions that have, this one in Tennessee was one for earlier grades, and so I think, and that's considered to be the most optimistic evidence of class size reduction.
Well, thank you very much. This excellent presentation has been broadcast simultaneously on webcast and internet, so there's a large audience out there. Thank you very much.